It is fantastic to see you. We were lucky enough to have you here in LA for a week, and now you're back in Doha, and you are well missed. It was lovely to have you here and to get to know
Yes.
you and have as much fun as we did. Um, and I really want to talk about the film very specifically because this is a very personal, very poetic visual essay that is much different than what we normally see and really deserves and requires almost a gentle, positive approach from the audience just to take their time. This is not a film you rush through. This is a film that you consider as you are moving through it. So, of course, the film is "And Then They Burn the Sea," and it is you used this visual storytelling method to explore the concepts of loss and memory at the same time that your mother was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. And so the visual style, I think, really informs your storytelling. Or am I wrong? Was it the other way around? Like, was your storytelling designed to create the visual approach? I think you have to tell me what that is, not me telling you
Right,
what that is.
right. Thank you, of course. And I mean, you're right in the sense that the film really took, I think, a span of time, and obviously films require effort, but it took a lot more than I think what a film typically does. And that personal nature, I think in some ways answers that question. There's a very important fact about the making of this film, that I really wanted to make it with my mother, and to perhaps approach it in a more direct way, because I started recording these audio clips with my mother, and in them I even say, when I was going back and revisiting, is I want to make a film with you. And she was quite happy, and it was sort of the early stages of the illness where we could have a conversation. And it was sort of amidst a moment where my relationship with my mother was quite fragmented and fractured, but also quite deep. And that was a way of me kind of, I began this as this very, personal way of almost understanding something that I didn't want to just be so much like held back by, and to feel sort of driven towards, as a method. It was almost like a way of seeing and understanding the moment later on, sort of like keeping it for later because I can't actually understand what's happening. And so I intended to make it with her as a conversation, but quickly on, and given the nature of early onset, it deteriorates quite quickly. And it almost became almost impossible to make the film the way I had wanted. And I think a lot about films like that have addressed this sort of topic, like Dick Johnson is Dead, which was on Netflix 2 years ago. A beautiful way to kind of understand this sort of relationship between the parent and the illness. But also it affords a certain kind of luxury that I didn't have. And what ended up happening was I began to think through in a very slow manner how cinema can become, or this sort of visual style can become almost in service of these conditions. And sometimes quite intuitively, and sometimes in a more planned manner and symbolically and through metaphors, like the sea and like this sort of cultural ritual that doesn't exist anymore, of a kind of way in which people sought the sea both as a symbol of hope and livelihood, but also a source of pain and suffering. And so that act of burning it sort of tame it, even though it wouldn't. I think that kind of somewhat symbolized this relationship to this loss, in which I couldn't really find a way to reverse it or sort of also understand why it's happening, to have an acceptance of it. And so these specific motifs in the film almost became really like in these abstract ways, but sometimes really simple, that their modes of communication, the hands and the touch, really was almost the only way I could communicate with her at some point. You really feel the person's presence, and it's almost there's that the touch is a repository of memory. And it really made me think a lot about what these things can do for this process and this journey that the film was taking me on. So I would say, you know, the subject and the context and the life situation really informed the style, but it almost like also taught me how to really think about a different language, which I found to be quite liberating.
It's beautiful.
Um,
It's really beautiful. You know, I also want to make sure we touch on how this film speaks to you as a filmmaker in a very particular way, because you work with the Doha Film Institute, you're a programmer, you work with industry programming. Doha Film Institute produced the film uh, and are massively supportive of the film. They also put you together with a mentor who just happens to be a rather famous Cambodian Academy Award winning director, Rudy Pan. And
right.
you have a very unique relationship with Rudy, or Mr. Pan, I should say. Uh, can you talk just briefly, even about a little bit about what that
Yeah,
looks like for you creatively? Creatively,
right. I mean, I think my relationship to Riti Pan was, I think, one of the most important relationships I've had in my life. Um, it was, even though the Doha Film Institute was quite involved in the production, they didn't necessarily pair me with him in this sort of like controlled manner. It was an open lab for about 15 participants, and you know, each one of us had to pitch our projects to him, and he, you know, in a very, in his sort of, I think, in his point of wisdom, but also experience when it comes to what it takes to make a documentary, what kind of questions are personal as much as they are cinematic, really are of gravity, that they're not so much just sort of choices you make and don't understand the cost and the repercussions on what it creates. And so Riti has dealt with a lot, with losing his family and losing with a lot of the people that, you know, that created what he called home. And his sort of conversation with a lot of us, but specifically with me, was about understanding why this is necessary to make of a film. Because I had my reservations at first, as much as I had really been so invested in making a film about my mother as a way to reconcile with what I had. This conversation became almost a sense of, this is almost a fight against a kind of loss that could destroy us and could really like take away our sense of like, you know, being in this world. And Riti kind of created this environment that's quite intense, and I think also educational, where he drove me to a place where I really felt that for me as a filmmaker, both understanding what kind of challenges are personal but also public, that others might actually
right?
find ways to reach out to, were quite crucial to address. And I think culturally speaking, this film probably wouldn't come off as challenging in terms of its
Mm.
images to a broader audience, but I think a lot of the peers here in the audience have found it striking that something so private has been imagined and put on the image.
That's
Um, they,
that's really it.
yeah,
isn't it? It's that
Yeah,
something
yeah,
so private has been put into the image. I think that's the perfect encapsulation of what the film really, really brings to the viewer's experience, because it is an experience.
yeah,
Um, I feel like we could talk for hours and hours about all the different parts of the puzzle here, and I hope that when the audience sees it, because people are watching this, some who have seen it, some who are about to see it, I hope that they also feel like they could talk for hours and hours, and maybe that'll be the next Q&A
yeah,
discussion we'll schedule for a couple of hours. But in
yeah,
the
hopefully.
meantime, thank you so much for taking time away.
Thank
I
you.
know the World Cup is going on over there. I know you've got other responsibilities and duties, so we really appreciate that you
Thank you.
found a few minutes to come in and sit down with us at Vidiots to have the Q&A.
My
So thank you
pleasure.
so much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. And I hope that we'll have you back in LA soon, because it was really a pleasure.
Hopefully, hopefully.
Yay. Yay. Thank you, Majid. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you.
It's gonna